The mist clung to the ground like it didn't want to let go. It had rolled in before dawn, curling around the pine trunks, swallowing the edges of the trail until even the nearest markers seemed like ghosts. Somewhere in that haze, Mara Linton had disappeared. By Monday morning, Elise Keating had called her phone 9 times. The last text she'd sent, "Back yet?" still sat there without the little read receipt. Elise told herself Mara was probably sleeping off the hike, that the reception out by Pine Ridge was patchy. But when noon came and Mara still hadn't shown up to work, Elise's stomach began to twist in ways she couldn't talk herself out of. 2 o'clock. She was standing at the ranger station, her voice low but urgent. "My friend's car is still at the trailhead," she told the deputy behind the desk. She was supposed to be back yesterday. They sent 2 officers out first. Elise followed in her own car, unable to sit still. The road to Pine Ridge wound through thick forest, the branches arching overhead in a tunnel of wet green and shadow. The further she drove, the more the signal bars on her phone bled away until the last one vanished. Mara's silver hatchback sat crooked at the far end of the parking area. Pine needles stuck to the windshield, damp from the mist. A pair of empty coffee cups rested in the cup holders, and a sweater lay folded neatly in the passenger seat. The same sweater Elise had seen her wear the night before she left. The driver's door had been locked. Search teams gathered quickly. Rangers in dark jackets, a few volunteers from town, 2 dogs that barked sharply before bounding into the trees. Elise kept close to the line of searchers, watching every shadow between the trunks, every dip in the moss. The forest was too quiet. Any chance she just stayed out there? One ranger asked Elise in a low voice. "She wouldn't," Elise said, not without telling someone. By the 3rd hour, the light began to change. Not quite evening yet, but dim enough that the fog turned from silver to blue. They found nothing. No water bottle, no dropped backpack. Not even a boot print they could be sure was hers back at the parking lot. Elise stood with her hands buried in her coat pockets, staring at the hatchback. Something about the scene felt wrong, staged almost. Like Mara had left the car there on purpose, but never meant to come back for it. When the deputy finally told her they'd have to pause the search until morning, Elise's throat went tight. "She's not just missing," she said quietly. "Something happened." The deputy didn't answer. He only glanced at his partner before making a note in his little pad. By nightfall, the news had spread across the town. People whispered over dinner tables and in grocery store aisles. Why was she hiking alone? Didn't she just break up with that guy? Maybe she wanted to disappear. Elise overheard fragments everywhere she went, and each one felt like a pebble dropped into her chest. That night she sat on her couch with the TV off, the silence heavy. She tried to remember the last thing Mara had said to her. "It was over coffee just 3 days ago. I'll be fine. I need this." Elise turned the words over in her mind until they began to feel less like reassurance and more like a warning she hadn't recognized. When she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, she dreamed of pine branches closing overhead, blotting out the light, and of footsteps that didn't belong to her or Mara. In the morning, the search would begin again. And so would the questions. The ones Elise was starting to fear had answers she didn't want to know. The second morning began with helicopters. From her kitchen window, Elise could hear the steady thump of rotor blades echoing over the ridge, fading, then returning again like a heartbeat. The search had doubled in size overnight. More rangers, more dogs, more people from town showing up with gloves and thermoses of coffee. By mid-morning, camera crews had arrived too, staking out the trailhead with tripods and bright lights that cut through the mist. Elise stood a few feet back from the barricade, arms crossed, watching them zoom their lenses toward the forest as though the answers might stroll out into the open. One reporter called her name, but she turned away. She hadn't slept enough to face questions she didn't know how to answer. Rumors traveled faster than the search lines. In the grocery store parking lot, a woman Elise barely knew leaned in close and whispered, "I heard Mara was fighting with someone last week, a man." She said it the way people talk about storms on the horizon, something inevitable, dangerous, and thrilling. By the end of the day, Elise had heard at least 3 versions of the story. One neighbor claimed the man was tall with dark hair and an expensive watch. Another swore he'd been driving a green pickup. None of them knew his name. The forest itself seemed to resist giving anything away. Elise walked with one of the search teams for an hour, stepping over wet roots, ducking under low branches. The pines grew so close in places that the air felt heavier, muffled. The wind didn't pass through. It curled and stilled. Even the birds stayed silent, their absence more unsettling than their calls would have been. It was a place built for keeping secrets. The moss underfoot was soft enough to hide a footprint in minutes. The tangled undergrowth could conceal something or someone just steps from the trail. Elise kept glancing into the shadows, half expecting to see a flash of Marat's purple hiking jacket, and half dreading she actually would. Late in the afternoon, Elise sat on the tailgate of a ranger's truck, sipping bitter coffee from a paper cup. Her phone buzzed, a text from Ryan, Marat's boyfriend. "Can we talk?" They met at a diner on the edge of town. The place smelled faintly of grease and coffee grounds, the air stale with the kind of quiet that followed bad news. Ryan looked exhausted, his blonde hair messy, the shadows under his eyes making him seem older. "I thought she was with you," he said, picking at the edge of his napkin. "She was supposed to be hiking," Elise replied. "You didn't know?" He shook his head. "We had plans Saturday night. She canceled Friday. No reason, just said she couldn't make it. I figured she needed space. Double quo. Did you ask why?" "Of course I did," Ryan said, a flicker of irritation in his voice. "She just said, it's better this way." The words hit Elise with a strange weight. The same way Marat's last sentence to her, "I need this," had lingered. Both felt unfinished, like the start of a confession that never came. Ryan's gaze dropped. She was scared of something, I could tell. But she wouldn't tell me what. They sat in silence for a moment, the low hum of the diner's refrigerator filling the space. Elise realized then that Ryan wasn't asking questions about the search. He was watching her as if she might know more than she was saying. Outside, the late light bled orange over the pines. Elise stood, pulling her jacket tighter, the image of Marat's locked car flashing in her mind. Someone out there had answers. And she couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching the search just as closely as she was. The day after meeting Ryan, Elise let herself into Marat's apartment with the spare key she'd never returned. The place smelled faintly of cedar and something floral, the same candle Mara always burned in the evenings. It was unsettling how normal everything felt, as if Mara might step out of the bedroom at any second, hair damp from a shower, rolling her eyes at Elise for snooping, but the normalcy was a lie, the unwashed coffee mug in the sink, the mail still stacked on the table, the jacket slung over the back of a chair. They were all frozen midlife, like a photograph taken seconds. Before someone vanished, Elise started in the living room, straightening piles of books and wiping dust from the coffee table. She told herself she was just helping, that Mara would hate to come back to a mess, but underneath she knew she was looking. It was when she reached the bedroom that she noticed the smell of smoke, faint, old, like something burned weeks ago and was hastily aired out. On the desk sat an empty ceramic dish, blackened in the center. Inside it lay the curled remains of a photograph. Half of it had been reduced to brittle ash, but the other half was intact. It showed Mara standing beside a man Elise didn't recognize. He was tall, with a dark jacket and a hand clasped over hers. His grip seemed too tight. Marat's smile in the image wasn't the easy one Elise knew. It was thin, careful. Elise turned the photo over, no date, no names. The edges smelled faintly of char, and she could see where the fire had licked. Dangerously close to erasing the man's face, her first thought was to call the police. Her second was to slip the picture into her own bag before anyone else could see it. She wasn't sure why she did the latter, only that something about the image felt personal, like a secret Mara had almost destroyed but couldn't bring herself to finish. As Elise sat on the bed, the quiet of the apartment seemed to close in. She let her mind drift back to the last few weeks before Marat's trip. One memory surfaced immediately. A Tuesday night, Wine glasses on the table, the two of them watching an old movie. Mara had been distracted, her phone lighting up every few minutes. Each time she'd glance at the screen, frown, and flip it face down. "You okay?" Elise had asked then. Mara had forced a smile. "Yeah, just work stuff." But the way she'd wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself, the way her laughter had been half a beat late, Elise had noticed another memory. Meeting Mara for coffee 3 days before the hike. Mara had seemed restless, eyes darting to a window whenever someone passed. She'd stirred her drink so long the ice melted. "I'm fine," she'd said, unprompted. "Really?" Back in the present, Elise set the half-burned photograph on the nightstand, staring at it like it might shift under her gaze. The man's eyes, though partly shadowed, were fixed on the camera, direct, assessing. A knock at the door startled her. She shoved the photograph into her bag before opening it. It was a detective from the search team, polite but probing, asking if Mara had ever mentioned anyone unusual. Elise heard herself say, "No, nothing," and hated how natural the lie sounded. When the detective left, Elise leaned against the closed door, heart thudding. She wasn't sure yet who the man in the photograph was or why Mara had been with him. But she knew instinctively that the police weren't the first people she wanted to tell. For now, this was hers to keep, a thread she could pull on without interference. She slid the photo deeper into her bag, out of sight, feeling its weight more than its size outside. The late afternoon sun was fading into the kind of cold blue twilight that made the pines look almost black. Somewhere out there, between the shadows and the silence, was the rest of the photograph's story, and Elise was starting to suspect that to find Mara, she'd have to find him first. The man in the photograph stayed with Elise long after the search faded. In the first weeks, she told herself that keeping it secret was temporary, just until she knew more. But weeks became months, and months bled into years. The police found no trace of Mara, no clothing, no equipment, no body. By the second anniversary, the search was a memory people brought up only when the pines turned gold in autumn. The media stopped calling. The flyers with Mara's face curled at the corners and were replaced by notices for yard sales and church events. Elise kept the photograph in the back of a desk drawer, inside an envelope marked only with the date she'd found. She looked at it less often now, but every time she did, the man's unreadable expression burrowed under her skin. Life didn't exactly move forward, it just thinned. Elise stopped hosting dinners. Stopped going to the hiking club she and Mara had joined together. Her friendships withered into polite texts twice a year. At work, she became the quiet one in the corner, dependable, invisible. The guilt was quieter now, but deeper, like a root system spreading under the surface. She would be walking through the produce aisle or folding laundry when it would suddenly hit her. I should have done more. I should have asked better questions. On the 5th anniversary of Mara's disappearance, a storm rolled in before dawn. It was the kind that seemed to shake the trees from their foundations, the wind howling through the pine needles in a voice that wasn't quite human. By morning, branches littered the trailhead at Pine Ridge, some large enough to block parts of the path. That afternoon, a young couple from a neighboring town decided to hike the trail anyway. The woman later told reporters that she almost turned back when the path narrowed under the fallen limbs, but her partner convinced her to keep going. It was he who noticed something odd near the base of a toppled pine, a patch of earth darker than the surrounding soil, as if it had been disturbed recently. Half hidden under wet pine needles was a corner of black plastic. They pulled at it, and it came free with a sucking sound from the mud. Inside was something heavy, rectangular, wrapped in layers of cloudy, weather-worn plastic. When they peeled it back, the smell of damp leather rose into the air. It was a journal, dark brown. The cover softened and swollen from years of moisture, its edges frayed like old fabric. The clasp was rusted but intact. The couple carried it straight to the ranger station. From there, it was taken into evidence, and within hours, Elise's phone rang. She sat in the station's small conference room, the journal placed on the table in front of her. Even through the clear evidence bag, she recognized the handwriting on the first page. Mara's. Her breath caught. For 5 years, the only things Elise had of Moraz were photographs and the sweater folded in the back of her closet. Now here was something Mara had touched, written in, maybe even left behind on purpose. The ranger told her they'd wait for a formal review before opening it. But later that night, lying in bed, Elise kept picturing it, the warped cover, the faint impression of words visible through the first page, the possibility that Marat's voice was still in there, waiting to be heard somewhere between midnight and dawn. Elise knew she wouldn't be able to stay away from it. And when the journal was finally unsealed, she would read it. Every page. Every word. 3 days after the journal's discovery, Elise was called back to the station, this time. The conference room was colder, the blinds drawn against the weak afternoon light. On the table sat the leather journal, freed from its evidence bag, the clasp pried open with careful precision. Detective Hart slid it toward her. "We'd like you to confirm if this is hers." Elise hesitated before touching it, her fingers brushing the water-warped cover. It felt heavier than it looked. She flipped open the first page and saw the looping, slanted handwriting she'd know anywhere. "It's Maraz," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. The first entries were dated 5 days before. She vanished. They read like fragments of a hiker's log, weather conditions, elevation changes, trail markers she'd passed. Overcast morning, ridge fog heavy. Saw deer near mile marker 3. Elise turned another page. More of the same. Wind shifted east, creek running high. The writing was neat, measured, her pen pressing just hard enough to dent the paper. Then, halfway down a page dated October 14th, the tone shifted, "If this is found." "He's closer than you think." The words cut through Elise like ice water. They weren't followed by an explanation. Just a new line about the temperature and a note on a patch of wild mushrooms. Hart leaned forward. "What do you think that means?" "I don't know," Elise lied, her thumb pressed against the edge of the page to keep it from trembling. The police photographed the entries, bagged the journal again, and began drafting paperwork to officially reopen Marat's case. The room felt charged, as if the air itself had shifted. Elise gave her statement, then walked out into the crisp October air, her mind still stuck on that single sentence. Later that evening, she couldn't stop thinking about the pages she hadn't been allowed to read. Hart had only shown her enough to confirm authorship. The rest would go through formal review. But the thought of Marat's voice being trapped behind police tape gnawed at her. 2 days later, she got her chance. Detective Hart had asked her to clarify some of Marat's writing style. The journal was laid out again in front of her, and Hart was called away for a phone call that lasted far longer than expected. Elise's eyes moved quickly over the pages, absorbing every word she could before the opportunity vanished. The entries after the warning line grew stranger. Mara wrote about shadows on the trail and the feeling of being matched step for step. She mentioned a debt he says I can't run from and the look in his eyes when I told him no. The last entry before the break in Hart's notes was scrawled, the letters uneven, as if she'd been writing while moving. "I'm not sure where the trail ends anymore. Every path feels like it leads to him." Elise's chest tightened. She felt like she was trespassing into something raw. Private? Not just a diary, but a record of fear that Mara had carried alone. When Hart returned, Elise sat back in her chair. The journal closed, her face composed. Walking home, the words followed her like whispers under the wind. "He's closer than you think." Whoever he was, Mara had left that warning like a flare in the dark, and somehow Elise knew it was meant to be found. That night, she took the photograph of Mara and the unknown man from its envelope. The corners were beginning to curl, but his face was still as sharp and unreadable as ever. She set it beside her lamp, next to her notes about the journal, and stared at the two pieces of evidence as if they might speak to each other. If the journal was the key, then the man in the photograph was the lock. And Elise had just decided. She was going to pick it no matter what it took. The sound of rain still echoed in Elise's ears when she left the police station. The image of Marat's handwriting burned into her mind. Those looping letters, the ones she'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists, now spelled out something far darker. Daniel Mercer. The name had been scrawled in the margin of a short, tense entry. No explanation, no date, just the words. He's closer than you think. He always is. It wasn't in the police's copy of the journal. Elise had noticed the omission the moment Detective Rayner handed her the official transcript, his voice careful, as if speaking too loudly might make her break. That line and the name had been in the actual pages she held before. She returned them. Someone had chosen to leave it out. Her hands tightened around her umbrella as she walked home. The streets smelled like wet asphalt, her boots splashing through shallow puddles. She thought about calling Rayner, about demanding to know why Mercer's name wasn't in the files. But the urge to keep this to herself was stronger. It was the same pull she'd felt with the half-burned photograph 5 years ago. That night, she sat at her kitchen table with a single lamp casting a yellow circle on the wood. The journal lay open, Marat's words pulling her in again. Being watched. Debt she can never repay. Not the kind you can give back in money. The entries grew erratic toward the end, handwriting jagged, ink smudged, lines written over each other until they were almost illegible. When she finally looked up, the clock said 2:17 a.m. The rain had stopped, and the silence outside pressed against the windows. Elise poured herself another cup of coffee. Even though her stomach churned, the next morning she did what she'd been avoiding for years. She called Alex Rourke. Marat's ex-boyfriend answered on the third ring, his voice rough with sleep. Elise? It's been, God, I don't know, years. I need to see you, she said. It's about Mara. There was a pause, long enough for her to hear the faint hum of his fridge in the background. All right. My place noon? His apartment? Smelled faintly of old beer and paint thinner. The blinds were half closed, letting in stripes of pale light. He looked older, hair shorter, jaw set in a way that made him seem perpetually on edge. She set the name down on the coffee table between them like a piece of evidence. Daniel Mercer? Did she ever mention him? His eyes flicked to it then. Back to her, his jaw tightened. Where'd you hear that? In her journal, a muscle in his cheek jumped. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. You think I had something to do with what happened to her? That's why you're here. I'm here because this name is in her handwriting, and no one's talking about it. Alex's voice rose, sharp. I'm not the one she should? Be afraid of, Elise. He stood, pacing. You think you know what she was into, but you don't. I told her to leave it alone. She didn't listen. Leave what alone? But he shook his head, eyes darting toward the window as if expecting. Someone there. If you're smart, you'll burn that journal and forget you ever read it. The conversation ended with her being shown to the door, his expression carved into something between fear and fury. She stood on the landing for a long moment, the sound of a television flickering from another apartment, her pulse still SUDDING. By the time she reached her car, she'd already decided she wouldn't burn anything. She would find out who Daniel Mercer was and why Mara never spoke his name aloud. Far away. In the dim corner of a diner 2 towns over, a man stirred his coffee slowly, glancing at a folded newspaper. The front page carried Marat's photograph. Under the headline, Cold Case Reopened After Journal Discovery. He smiled faintly. As if he'd been waiting, the name Daniel Mercer had already been circling in Elise's mind like a vulture for days, refusing to land but never leaving. After her tense exchange with Marat's ex-boyfriend, she'd gone home and reread every page of the journal twice, hoping for some overlooked clue. But it wasn't a new line in Marat's handwriting that set the next wave in motion. It was an email. The subject line was simple. I knew her. Elise stared at it for a full minute before opening it. The message was brief, the kind that seemed written in haste but with deliberate weight behind every word. I knew Mara. We need to talk. Not over the phone, not by email. In person, there was no name, just a place and time, a small coffee shop in the old part of town. The next afternoon, against every warning bell in her head, Elise went. The coffee shop was dim, lit mostly by the hazy gray daylight seeping through rain-streaked windows. She spotted the woman instantly, early 40s, tense posture, scanning the room every few seconds as though she expected someone to burst through the door. She wore a black coat zipped to her throat despite the mild weather. You're Elise, the woman said quietly without offering her name. And you... Knew Mara? Elise asked, sitting down. The woman's eyes flicked toward the counter, then the window. I did. We met through work. I wasn't close to her, not at first. But I saw things. She leaned forward. Things you won't hear from the police. Things Mara didn't want in the open. Elise's pulse quickened. What kind of things? Mercer, the woman said, her voice nearly a whisper. They were involved. Not just casually, secretly. She didn't tell her friends. She didn't tell anyone who could have helped her. Elise frowned. The journal said she was being watched. Is that about him? The woman nodded sharply. It ended badly. I don't know exactly what happened, but she was scared. Really scared. I overheard one fight. I couldn't make out all of it, but she said something about never forgiving. Him and not paying for his mistakes. He said she didn't have a choice. A tremor passed through her hands. She folded them tightly in her lap. The day she disappeared, I saw him. Elise's breath caught. Where? Near. The trailhead. I was driving by. He was in his truck, parked off to the side like he didn't want to be noticed. When I slowed down, he looked right at me. Her voice dropped lower and smiled. A heavy silence settled between them. You need to tell the police, Elise said. The woman's reaction was immediate, a flinch followed by a hard shake of her head. No, absolutely not. You don't understand. Mercer has ways. He's not someone you can go after and walk away clean. If he knows I'm talking... She cut herself off, eyes darting to the door again. Elise leaned forward. Then why tell me? Because someone needs to know. Someone who won't be silenced by fear. I'm not that person? You might be. Before Elise could respond, the woman stood. Don't try to contact me again. She left without looking. Back, the bell above the door jingling faintly. Elise sat there long after her coffee went cold. The rain outside blurring the street into indistinct shapes. Someone else had seen Mercer near that trail. Someone else believed he was dangerous. But without the woman's testimony, it was just another unprovable thread in a case already fraying at the edges. Still, Elise felt the shift. She wasn't chasing shadows anymore. The pieces were real, and they were sharp enough to cut. She pulled the journal from her bag and turned to the last entry she'd read. There was a line she'd skimmed before, too distracted to dwell on it. If I disappear, find the cabin. Elise stared at the words, her reflection faint in the coffee shop's window. The storm outside had eased, but inside her something new was gathering, not just fear this time, but direction. The woman's voice still echoed in Elise's mind. Long after the call ended, low, trembling, yet weighted with something sharper than fear. She had spoken of Mara and Daniel Mercer as if recalling a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Elise replayed every word as she sat at her kitchen table, Mara's weathered journal lying open before her, its pages smelling faintly of damp earth. And Pine, the last entry she'd read, still stared back at her. I can't keep living like this. He knows. He's waiting. Tomorrow I meet him on the ridge. We end it. Her fingers brushed over the ink. The handwriting here was tense letters. Sharper, as though Mara's pen had dug into the paper. Elise turned another page, the next date marked in the same hurried scrawl. The lines began normally, a note about the weather, a comment about her boots being soaked, and then stopped mid-sentence. No period. No smudge of ink trailing off as if she'd been distracted. Just absence. Elise stared at that abrupt ending, the blank space below it radiating unease. She imagined Mara sitting cross-legged on the forest floor, the journal balanced on her knee, pausing mid-thought because a sound pulled her attention away. A twig snapping, a shadow shifting. A voice calling her name. The air in the kitchen felt suddenly stale. Elise closed the journal and slid it toward herself as if to guard it from unseen eyes. In the days since the call, she had combed through the earlier pages again and again, looking for threads she'd missed. Between the weather notes and trail sketches, Mara had hidden small admissions. I told him I can't pay. He says I owe him more than money. Elise read them differently now. Hearing the edge beneath the casual phrasing, the implication was ugly and persistent. Blackmail. It wasn't money alone. Elise felt certain of that. Something in Marat's past, something she'd worked to bury, had been unearthed. The journal made it clear that Mercer wasn't letting her forget. On the counter, her phone buzzed with a message from Detective Hanlon. "Anything else in the journal you haven't shared yet?" Elise stared at the screen. Without typing. Hanlon had been patient, but she wasn't ready to hand over everything. Some part of her needed to read through Marat's words in private first, to understand them without police filters or legal boundaries. That night, she spread the journal pages across her bed, aligning them by date. It became clear that the entries around the week of her disappearance were more frantic, sentences repeating, references to being followed. One page contained a crude map, a fork in the trail, an arrow pointing toward a shaded area labeled only Old Mine Road. Elise didn't remember Mara ever mentioning an old mine. Her phone screen lit up again, this time with an unknown number. She let it go to voicemail, but no message came. The wind rattled the window, and she thought of the woman on the phone, the one too afraid to talk to police. Fear that deep didn't vanish. It lived in the bones. If she was telling the truth, Mara had gone to that meeting knowing danger was close, maybe closer than she'd admitted to anyone. Elise picked up the final page again. That last unfinished sentence glared at her in the lamplight. She whispered the words aloud. As if they might sound different in the air, they didn't. Something had silenced Mara before she could finish the thought. And Elise, with the journal as her only guide, was starting to believe that whatever had stopped her might still be out there. The air outside the cafe was crisp, sharp enough to sting Elise's cheeks as she stood across the street watching through the large, fogged windows. Mercer was already there, seated at a corner table, sipping from a white ceramic mug. He wore the kind of casual confidence that felt rehearsed to clean jeans, an open leather jacket, sunglasses perched in his hair despite the cloud cover. Elise inhaled deeply, her pulse matching the ticking of her watch. The last lines of Marat's journal still burned in her mind, the way they stopped mid-thought. No goodbye, no conclusion. Just, "I see him," and then silence. She crossed the street. "Daniel," she greeted, forcing a polite smile as she slid into the chair opposite him, his lips curved in a faint smirk. "You must be Elise, the sister." The word sister rolled from his mouth with a calculated weight, as if he'd been preparing for this meeting. Elise folded her hands on the table, masking the recorder hidden inside her purse. "I'm not here to accuse you," she began, keeping her voice steady. I need some kind of closure. The police say there's nothing new. I thought maybe you could help me understand Marat's last days." He leaned back, studying her. "Closure," he echoed, as though testing the word. The thing about missing people. Sometimes they're missing because they want to be." The statement landed like a stone in her chest. She let a beat pass, letting him fill the silence. "You're saying she wanted to disappear?" Elise asked. Careful not to sound too eager, Mercer shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "Some people get in over their heads. They make choices, bad ones, and then, well, the wilderness is a good place to get lost. Or to hide." Elise's throat tightened, but she kept her gaze fixed on him. "And you think Mara made a bad choice?" "I think she knew there were consequences coming," he said, his voice dropping just enough to force her to lean forward. "Some debts can't be paid, not with money." The words were deliberate, almost taunting. Elise could hear the faint hum of the recorder in her purse. "Debts to who?" She pressed. Mercer smirked again, but this time it felt thinner, strained. "Let's just say she was closer to danger than you realize. And maybe she thought it was better for everyone if she stayed gone." Elise's nails bit into her palm under the table. "You make it sound like she chose her fate." "Maybe she did," he replied, his eyes narrowing. "And maybe some people don't want to be found." For a moment, the cafe's background noise, the hiss of the espresso machine, the clink of spoons, seemed to fade. Elise felt the shift in him, the tiny slip in control that told her she'd gotten under his skin, but he didn't elaborate. Instead, he rose, dropping a few bills on the table. "Good luck with your closure," he said. his tone mocking as he walked out. Elise sat still, listening to the muffled recording in her purse. The words were damning in tone, but hollow in proof, implication without admission. The police would call it hearsay, circumstantial at best, unless she found something physical. Something Mercer couldn't explain away. Her gaze drifted to the leather jacket he'd left unzipped. In the inside pocket she'd glimpsed a folded map, weathered, creased and marked in red ink. It wasn't enough. But it was a start. And if she was right about what those marks meant, then the trail Mercer had walked wasn't entirely cold. Not yet. The forest seemed to hold its breath as Elise stepped beneath the towering pines once more. The air was cool and damp, thick with the scent of earth and needles. Sunlight filtered weakly through the dense canopy, casting long shadows that danced with every whisper of the wind. She tightened the straps of her backpack, the worn leather journal tucked safely inside, and unfolded the fragile map she'd traced from Marat's last entries. Every line and mark on the paper felt like a thread leading deeper into a secret the forest had kept for too long. The map led her past familiar trail markers, then off the beaten path, where the pine needles grew thick and the ground softened underfoot. The silence here was absolute, swallowing her footsteps, making her acutely aware of each breath and heartbeat. The directions from Marat's writing were precise yet cryptic. Follow the ridge to the old mine road. Take the left fork past the fallen birch. And then look for the stone that doesn't belong. Hours passed as Elise moved carefully through the undergrowth, eyes scanning every moss-covered rock and twisted root. She reached the fork and spotted the lone gray stone, oddly smooth amid the jagged terrain. Heart pounding, she began to clear away leaves and pine needles around its base. Her fingers brushed something hard beneath the earth. She dug deeper with a stick, then with bare hands, until she uncovered a shallow depression resembling a grave long forgotten. Moss and ferns crept over its edges, trying to swallow it whole. Inside, half buried in damp soil, was a small object, glinting faintly. Elise pulled it free, a delicate silver chain, broken, with a tiny pendant shaped like a leaf Marat's necklace. Next to it, a scrap of faded fabric, torn and stained dark. Her breath hitched, the blood old but unmistakable. For a moment, Elise closed her eyes, the weight of the discovery pressing down like the dense canopy above. This spot, the place Mara had marked in her journal. The place she'd written about meeting Mercer, was no longer just a secret hidden beneath the pines. It was proof that Marat's story had been silenced here. Elise wrapped the necklace in fabric, carefully in a plastic bag she carried for emergencies. The wind stirred around her, carrying with it a faint rustle, as if the forest itself exhaled after years of holding its secret. She stayed a moment longer, tracing the outline of the shallow grave with her fingers, whispering a quiet apology. "I'm sorry it took this long." The path back felt heavier, each step laden with new purpose. When she reached the trailhead, her phone buzzed, a message from Detective Hanlon. "We're ready to move on Mercer." Elise's fingers trembled as she typed back, "I found something." "It's time." That evening, she sat in her small living room, the evidence spread before her on the coffee table. The silver leaf pendant gleamed under the soft lamplight, a fragile symbol of a life interrupted. The torn fabric still held a faint scent of pine and earth. The pieces of Marat's story were coming together, but so were the shadows around Mercer shadows. Elise was now determined to bring into the light. Tomorrow, Mercer would be questioned again. This time there would be more than words, and the pines, which had held their silence for so long, were finally ready to remember. The courtroom was hushed, the air thick with tension and whispered anticipation. Elise sat at the witness stand, the worn leather journal resting in her hands like a fragile relic. The pages had carried Marat's voice through years of silence, and now that voice was about to be heard by strangers, who held the power to deliver justice or deny it. The judge nodded for her to begin. Taking a deep breath, Elise opened the journal. To its final entry, the one that had haunted her since she first read it, the words that Mara had never finished. Her voice trembled slightly as she read aloud, filling the quiet courtroom with the weight of a confession and a farewell. October 15th. The ridge is colder than I expected. I feel him close, like a shadow that won't leave me alone. I don't know if I'll make it through today. But if this is found, if someone reads this, please understand. I never wanted to disappear, but I had no choice. The debt isn't mine to pay, but the cost is mine to bear. Elise paused, swallowing the lump in her throat. I'm writing this because the pines remember everything. They hold the secrets we buried beneath their roots. When they give me back, maybe then the truth will be free. Maybe then someone will know what really happened. She closed the journal gently, eyes lifting to meet the jury's faces, some somber, others unreadable. The silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred. Outside the courtroom, the weight of years pressed on Elise's shoulders. The trial had been grueling, Mercer's defense twisting words, denying all allegations, casting shadows of doubt. But Marat's journal, coupled with the physical evidence Elise had uncovered, had carved a path through the darkness. The jury's verdict came late that afternoon. Guilty. The gavel struck. A hollow relief echoed inside Elise. Justice, finally. But at a cost she hadn't anticipated. The years of searching, the sleepless nights haunted by what-ifs and maybes, none of it disappeared with that single word. She folded the journal carefully and tucked it under her arm, stepping out into the sharp autumn air. The world felt simultaneously brighter and emptier. In the days that followed, Elise wandered the trails Mara had loved, tracing her footsteps in the crisp crunch of pine needles beneath her boots. The forest seemed to whisper secrets still, stories, half-told in wounds not yet healed. She often found herself staring at the necklace, the delicate silver leaf now safely kept beside the journal. It was a fragile token of a life that had slipped away too soon, a reminder of the silence that had shrouded Mara for so long. At night, Elise wrestled with her feelings. Was this closure? Or just a pause in the endless ache? Marat's last words haunted her, when the pines give me back. They were a promise and a question, a reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, had a way of rising. Elise didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing with certainty. She would carry Marat's story with her, a testament. To love and loss, fear and courage, justice had been served. But the echoes of that autumn day lingered in the quiet spaces between the trees, whispers only the pines would remember.